Hello, thanks for joining me on my new adventure here. It's known as a podcast. I have been teaching the Bible for a number of years, but now we're entering this whole new realm, and I'm certainly excited about doing it. Now, this show, podcast, if you will, is it's going to be studying the Bible, but maybe in a little bit different methodology than you're used to, because we're going to do it more as a cerebral exercise than we are going to be doing it even as a spiritual exercise. We'll talk about the spiritual stuff, but over time. But I'm more going to look at this through my own personal experiences, and I myself am a military veteran. Uh, Over the time for the podcast, I'll get more into that and different things I did there and some of those experiences that were fun and interesting. But that this is more from my next career because after the military, I eventually got into law enforcement, where I have a couple of decades career, and in that time, I did a great deal of cop stuff. You investigate things, you use laws of evidence, you do rules of investigations and things like that. And it's how we're going to investigate this thing called the Bible. And that's why this new podcast that I've started is going to be called Investigation Bible, IB for short. But during Investigation Bible, we're going to be doing a lot of studying of things. Once again, we're not going to I'm not going to go through verses and say this is what this means to your life or any of that very much. I'm going to be doing more of the things like let's talk about what this Bible is, where it comes from, who wrote it. And every time we study a book, we're going to talk about the era that it was written in, who it was written to, who it was written from, and that kind of thing. That's the kind of investigation that I'd like to use in this thing. I want to also have guests come in over time and have them be people who can really add to our knowledge of both history and science and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. Um, Even in this very first episode, we're going to talk about what the Bible is and what it, like for example, it's not a book of science. It's not a science book, but it is a book that has a great deal of scientific statements in it. It's not a philosophy book, but it has it's a myriad of philosophical topics and subjects. It's not a history book, but it's chock full of history. It's not a psychological book, but it describes and kind of explores human psychology at a deeper level than anything prior to Freud, for sure. You go back prior to Freud, there's just nothing like it that explores the human psyche, if you will. And so it's a really interesting book. Now, I myself, just in once again, I told you I was retired law enforcement now, and a military guy. So I'm looking at it from that perspective and point of view, but also from my own youth because I was not raised in church. I went to church maybe a half a dozen times, maybe a dozen in my entire childhood, and that was usually for some event, something going on, or I got invited by somebody who went to church regularly, and I went. And that was fine. And I wasn't against it by any means, but my parents didn't attend. And we probably had a Bible or two around the house, but nobody read it. I mean, I didn't know anything about it at all. And I couldn't have told you anything about it, actually, except for that it was the Bible. But once again, I didn't ever read it. My parents didn't read it. My brothers and sisters didn't read it. So I had no knowledge of it. However, as a teenager, like so many teenagers, you kind of think you have full knowledge of everything. I don't know why teenagers think this way, but I was no different. And I thought I knew a lot. And so I thought it was fun to argue with people, to debate them. I thought that was enjoyable. And I did. And it wasn't just religious people, it was everybody. I just did it for everything, but I enjoyed doing it. And I didn't know what I was talking about. And that's the funny part as I look back historically at my own self, I had no idea what I was talking about. But I did it anyway. So I used to pose people questions. And if I knew you went to church, in high school, I wasn't trying to ruin anybody's faith or anything. I really wasn't trying to hurt anybody. I might have, not meaning to, but I used to ask them questions that they didn't answer. Like, there's so many mistakes in the Bible, and it has so many historical inaccuracies, and it's just wrong in so many places. How can you believe that thing to be the Word of God? By the way, I had never read that book and didn't know what these inaccuracies were supposed to be, but I had heard it, and so I said that. I used to say things like, well, Buddha and Muhammad and Jesus, they're all just the same, just in different cultures. And I would ask Christians these questions, young people that didn't know anything either, by the way. No big deal. Most young people don't. And they couldn't answer these questions, and I thought I was so smart. And then I went to work for a guy who was a Christian, and he was a nice guy. He was actually very honorable. He was a very honest guy, to the point to where he would make sure he didn't cheat anybody out of anything. I mean, he was a butcher, and he would sell 0.9 pounds of or 1.1 pounds of meat for a pound. Make sure he was over the poundage of meat, and he told me why. So and it was my job to weigh some of these things and stuff. So he told me, always give them more than I'm charging, and I didn't know why. And he said there's a Bible verse that says that God hates an unjust weight. Well, that's when I realized that he was a religious guy, and I really liked him, but I was not, and so I just kind of dismissed it. And he was my boss, so I didn't try and challenge him or anything. But over time, he was such an approachable person that I did ask him some of those questions, like, what about all the mistakes in the Bible? And he was the best person you could talk to, a teenager that thought he was smart, which I wasn't, but I thought I was. And he did not answer me. He did what I eventually found was the Socrates method, the Socratic method. He actually didn't answer anything. He just asked me questions, pointed right back at me. And I'd never experienced that from anybody. And I was taken aback. So I would say, what about all the inaccuracies in the Bible? And he'd go, well, what inaccuracies are there? Well, we all know there are. We do? Well, what are they? If you know what they are, why don't you tell me? We can talk about each one. Well, I had no idea what inaccuracies there were. And, the same thing with Buddha and Muhammad. I remember asking him, I said, well, don't you think their teachings are the same? And, they're just the same stuff, all sent from God, if they are. And he said, really? He goes, well, what does the Buddha teach? And, of course, I had no idea. He goes, what does Muhammad teach? I remember actually kind of telling him, well, like, be good to people and be nice to one another and you'll go to heaven. He goes, is that what they teach? And, of course, I didn't know. But he was educated and he did know. So he pointed the questions to me. What are the Four Noble Truths? What are the Eightfold Path or whatever from Buddhism? And I didn't have any idea. So I'm feeling stupid now. He wasn't trying to make me feel stupid, but I was really realizing how ignorant I was on the subject. And he actually challenged me to read books on the subject. And he gave me a list of books, pro and con, of Christianity. Things that were like Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian, but also Francis Schaeffer. Make sure you read both. Read C.S. Lewis. Make sure you read everybody involved on both sides of these arguments so that you can have a well-rounded argument, Bill. And he remember he even told me one point, he goes, shouldn't come back with any of these questions until you come up with some hard ones, which I thought I was asking hard questions. But it started me on a journey. I didn't become a Christian over that. I did not. But it started me on a path, if you will. I started on an exploration tour of what these people said, because I believed there was a God. I thought that was foolish not to believe in God. I even remember thinking as a young person, no one can be a true atheist because you can't know there's no God. That's an impossible knowledge to have. So you can be an agnostic, but I wasn't an atheist at all. And I wasn't even an agnostic. I believed there was a deity. I just didn't think any human knew who that deity could be. That's what I thought. That was my juvenile mindset. And so he had challenged me, and his name was Mike, and he did. And it started a process over a few years where I did study and I did read pro and con. And I found that the most of the time, the people who were against the Bible and against Christianity wasn't so much rooted in science other than the basic statement like, oh, well, we know the Bible's wrong scientifically, and we accept scientists don't believe the Bible, and all these blanket statements. But they're not a lot of specific stuff, okay? But every time I read a Christian apologist, I didn't even know they were called that yet, but that just means a person who gives an answer for a reason. Originally in Greek, the word apology means an answer. Okay, that's what it actually means. And doesn't mean I'm sorry. It means here's the answer to the question, your question. And so Christian apologists would deal with just intelligence, raw knowledge, basic facts, a lot of logic, and a lot of reason. And I found that to be interesting, that the Christians I was reading, like Schaeffer or Lewis, were really giving straightforward, logical, reasonable arguments for their faith, where some of the others were like, I don't believe in God because the world's a bad place. And if I were God, the world wouldn't be a bad place. Well, how do you know that? I mean, that's kind of an odd argument to pose. You don't know what it's like to be a God unless you are one. And even this movie came out years later, but after I'd come to knowledge or faith in God. But Bruce Almighty was a perfect example of, well, you think it's easy to be God? Well, here I'm going to give you some powers, and of course he messes the whole thing up. He just ruins everything. And I remember him saying he heard all these voices in his head. He's like, all these people around the world are praying, and Morgan Freeman played God, and he's like, those aren't the voices from around the world. That's just a city block. I mean, I'm probably misquoting it, but the point is it was a really good exercise in, I would do it this way. Well, maybe you wouldn't if you had ultimate power. Maybe you would, and maybe you'd make the place worse. I don't know. And so I always thought that, that was a reasonable position to take, that there was a deity and that he probably knew what he was doing, but I thought no human had any idea who this was. That's where I started. That's where I started my process. And as I read these people and found some really solid logical arguments for the existence of the God of the Bible, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it really shook me up. It did. And I didn't even become a Christian yet. It wasn't until I was in the military and life was going great, and I'd kind of come to this conclusion that maybe Jesus was who he said he was. And then I went the next step, and I actually went to a church. And that was when I was in the Army, and everything was going great. There's nothing wrong with this. The testimony of my life has fallen apart. I, drug addict, or, my parents won't talk to me, or I lost all my friends, or my children have rebelled and won't have anything to do with me. But then I came to Christ and he fixed everything. That's a good testimony. I like it. It's not mine at all. Everything was going great for me. I had good parents, good brothers and sisters, had a great upbringing. My life had gone well up to that point. I had a very successful military career up to that point. At that juncture, everything was going great in my life. There was no downside. And I even knew that, and I was a normal guy. I wasn't like, I didn't do everything wrong, but I didn't do everything right either. I was a normal guy. And so, normal soldier, drinking and, getting in some trouble once in a while and that kind of stuff. And I remember thinking, I was having so much fun doing that if I really do this Christian thing, that's going to be the problem. It's not that I've got problems and I need Christ. I don't have any problems. If I go to Christ, I'm going to get some problems because people aren't going to like this. And I was right. When I first started serving the Lord, people questioned it and couldn't seem to figure out why. And including my own family, But I knew that was going to happen. But I kind of came to the conclusion he was Lord. Then I went to church, and actually that's where the faith started. I started learning what this Bible taught. I had now read it, but I didn't understand it. But I had now at least read it. And so I had a basic knowledge of it and everything, but I came to Christ. And when I did, I realized that there was a lack of education amongst people in church about the histories and the sciences and the philosophies of this book. So that is kind of my foundation, and that's how I like to teach the Bible. Nothing wrong with teaching verse by verse and applying it to your life. That's actually important. But that's not what we're going to do in this podcast. We're going to do something a little different. So anyway, I'm going to break it down on the very first podcast to a few things. And then we're going to be short. It's not going to be a really long one on the first one here at all. But I want to break down what the Bible is. Okay? Basically, more like a college class. This isn't a church service. This is more like a collegiate class. Okay? So, what is the Bible? Well, the word Bible, biblios, means book. That's all it means. It just means book. And so we got to, in fact, you know that from your bibliography. When you do your college work and you have to give information on all the places you got your information, you have to cite, your citations and everything. And when you read a book that has citations, it gives you a bibliography of other books that gave you the information that you have. Same word, same idea, same word as Bible. So we have a book. The Bible is the holy book. That's what we call it, the Holy Bible. Now, holy is just a word. It doesn't mean like we use it much. In the original meaning of the word, it's separate for a cause. That's what it originally means. It's kind of today it means like a good person. You're a holy person. That means you're good, close to God or something. And it can mean that, but that's not the original intent of the word. The original intent of the word was to separate. This is a separate book that's different than the other books, the Holy Bible. This is separated out, and the idea is that's written by God. Okay? So I remember as a kid still saying to Christians, I said this. So God wrote the Bible? Yes, God wrote the Bible. Okay, well, how did he write it in heaven and then send it down to earth with angels, or did he drop it from heaven and it landed on the ground, somebody picked it up and started reading? I mean, how did that happen? Well, nobody knew. I mean, I had nobody answer me those things. So I was like, I thought I was being so clever. But the reality is it's a simple answer. This Bible was I believe it was written by God. But it was through his Holy Spirit, he did through people as they're inspired. And that's what even in the scriptures, it says that holy men being inspired by God wrote down these things that we now know as the Holy Bible. Okay? But, and so that mankind can know these things. But how do we take this book? It's divided up into a few different sections. First, we're going to divide it up into, it's 66 books. So first, it's just one thing. We're not going to divide it. It's one book, 66 different books inside of one book. Okay, but then what do? Well, we divide it between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, what does that mean? Well, God spoke to the nation of Israel because of a guy named Abraham, and he had talked to his offspring. Abraham followed God. God counted his righteousness to him. He told him that his children would be like the sands of the sea, and that through him, all the nations of the world would be blessed. And his offspring became the Israeli nation, the nation of Israel. Okay, and through those people, he rose up both prophets and teachers and priests and kings and stuff to write down things inside this book. And as they wrote stuff down, it was recorded and kept and all those kind of things. Now, most of it was written between the years 1500 BC, so that's before Christ. Christ was born at 0. I know BCE and CE, Common Era, before Common Era, everybody wants to say that nowadays because they've taken the name Christ out of it. But the reality is it's still the birth of Christ. No matter what, you're still calling it 0. It's not the Common Era, it's the birth of Christ era. So Jesus is born. Everything after that is 1 year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, 2022 years later, which is where we're at now. And then working backwards, it's the same idea. The birth of Christ is 0. And then if you're 1 year before the birth of Christ, that's 1 BC, meaning before Christ. And then 2 years would be 2. Let's go back to when Moses lived, because that's who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and that's about 1500 BC, roughly, 1,500 years before Christ. And so This book is written over a fairly long period of time because Moses starts it with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those are the first 5 books known as the law in the Israeli world. And, well, and anybody that studies this stuff, it's known as the law, written down by Moses. And then when we'll get into the individual reasons why we have information and how Moses got this information, but not today. I'm just more talking about the general idea of the book. So in this Old Testament, starting in 1500 BC, roughly, Moses starts it. It ends with the guy named John, the Apostle John. You've probably heard of him. You got the Gospel of John. And then he wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Those are letters that he wrote. And then we have the book of Revelation, where at the end of his life, or close to the end, God pulled him into heaven and showed him things that were going to happen in the future. He wrote them down, and that's known as the book of Revelation. That's the last book of the Bible. It was written in the 90s AD, so after the birth of Christ. Annos Domini, that's what it means. It's Latin. I don't actually know. I've never found out why we call it after the birth of Christ. We call it a Latin term, AD, Annos Domini. And before the birth of Christ, we call it an English term, BC. I don't know why we do it, but we do. So BC and AD. Now, I know that, once again, in the circles of education, they call it the Common Era or before the Common Era. I get that. And that's all in the English language, no Latin involved. But it's still based upon that 0 number, which is the birth of Christ. So now this book, as I said, it's divided into different sections. We have what we call the Old Testament. That started in about 1500 BC and ended at about 400 BC. Okay, so before the birth of Christ, in that time frame, a little over 1,000 years, that's when that book was written down, or that's when those 39 books were written down. If you remember, I said there was 66 books in this Bible. It's divided up into 2 sections, the Old Testament having 39 books and the New Testament having 27. That's how those 66 books can be divided, Old and New. The Old Testament was written down by children of Abraham, biological children of Abraham. And they were some prophets, and they were kings, and they were priests, and they were shepherds. And these are different people that wrote in this thing called what we call the Old Testament. I believe all inspired by God. And that was in that 1,000-year, little over 1,000-year period. Then it's called the Quiet Era, or the era where God didn't speak. And I don't think that that's true. I think historically he's always speaking to us. But there's no prophets that wrote anything down that was kept, okay, that was kept and then canonized as Holy Scripture. Other people wrote stuff, but it wasn't like, okay, that's definitely from God. And then the New Testament, that was written from about 50 AD, so about a little less than a decade or 2 decades after the death of Christ. Now, Jesus was born in his 33rd year. He was crucified, buried, and raised from the dead. That's a big deal. We'll talk about that in the future. But after that, then the church starts. Well, nobody wrote any of these New Testament books down for a little over a decade, and then they started getting written down, okay? And so the first book's written in the late 40s AD, early 50s AD. There's controversy on that, but it's all within a very short period of time. All eyewitnesses are still, not all, most eyewitnesses are still alive when these books are being written, and they're being sent to each of these new churches that had just cropped up as letters to read to each other. And so, and the last one being the book of Revelation, which I already said, written about in the 90s AD. Okay, so from about 50 to the mid-90s, 45 to 50 years period of the New Testament being written, where over 1,000 years of the Old Testament being written, but still written by about 40 authors, 40 different humans penned this book, okay? Now, we can divide the Old Testament into 3 sections, which is the law, that's Moses we talked about, the writings, that's the histories of what was going on in Israel and how God was dealing with them. And that includes Joshua and Judges, and that's pure history. And then it includes some of the philosophical books and even some of the historical books, the philosophical books being like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, the historical books being like Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. And those books are histories. They're pure histories. And that includes the histories of like in First Kings, Second Kings, First Samuel, Second Samuel, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. Those are all histories of the kings of the north and the south because they divided the country. There was a civil war in that country, like our own. The difference is instead of uniting the country, it divided it for the rest of their existence, the north and the south. But we're going to get into all that later. This is just telling you kind of how it's divided out. So you have the law, the first 5 books. Then you have the writings, what I just mentioned, and many more books in there. And then you have the prophets. Okay, now that's people you've heard of, like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel. You've heard of those people, no doubt. I mean, they're famous to this day. And people name their kids after these people, okay? So they're famous to this day. But it also includes a bunch of prophets that you probably never even heard of. Now, you've heard of Jonah, because Jonah and the whale, or Jonah and the big fish, and all that kind of stuff. But you probably never heard of Obadiah. He's a prophet in the Old Testament. You may have never heard of Habakkuk. He's a prophet in the Old Testament. They both wrote books that are still in this book called the Bible. Okay, and Malachi is a prophet you may have never heard of, but he wrote the last book of the Old Testament. Okay, and so so that's the sections: law, writings, prophets. Likewise, in the New Testament, we can divide it up into 3 sections also, and that's the Gospels, and those Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, those were people that at least 3 of them were eyewitnesses. Matthew and Mark and John were eyewitnesses to these events. They were following Jesus around while taking notes and all that kind of stuff. In fact, Matthew, you want some exact quotes, he's really good because he was a tax collector that knew how to do shorthand in Latin. He was for the Romans, so he wrote in a Latin script, and they had a system of writing in kind of a shorthand. So he had that ability because he had to deal with, that was his bosses, and he had to deal with them. So he was following Jesus, and what he wrote down is just like word for word, probably what Jesus said. And Mark was a little boy, teenager maybe, and his parents were following Jesus, and he was following him, and he wrote it down. He also was a disciple of Peter and Paul as he grew into adulthood. And then, now Peter was an eyewitness, so he told Mark a lot of things, undoubtedly, that he recorded in Mark. John was an eyewitness. He was actually Jesus' best friend on this earth. He wrote down what he remembered and all that kind of stuff. And he'd already read the first Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they already existed. And he goes, okay, those are all good. He didn't talk bad about them. He said, that's right. That's what Jesus did. But I'm going to tell you a few more things that I remember. And so John has a little bit different than what's called the Synoptic Gospels, which is they all tell basically the same story. He tells it a little differently, but only because he'd already read the first 3. He said, they're right, but I'm going to add some stuff that people forgot to write in, but I was there, and I'm going to write this down for you. And that's the Gospel of John, okay? And then you have the book of Acts. Now, Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote the book of Acts. And I'll call the Gospels and the book of Acts the first 5 books of the New Testament. And I put them together saying they're a section because they are the history of Jesus and the church, because that's what the book of Acts is. Now, Luke was not an eyewitness to Jesus, but what he was like a newspaper man, maybe a reporter. And he went to everybody and he talked to them. He'd become a Christian, and then he now talked to the people who were around Jesus. He spoke to Mary about the childhood. He did all kinds of stuff, talked to the other disciples that were with him, and he wrote it down as a newspaper man would, like, what did you hear? What did you learn? What did you see? And he recorded it, and he sent it off to a guy, both Luke and Acts, to tell him, hey, the things you've learned from us. Now he's going around preaching the gospel with Paul at this time. He says, these things you've learned from us, they're accurate, but I'm going to give you a really good account of them. And that's where we get the book of Luke and the book of Acts. And now he was around when the church was being built, so that's his own, his own experiences in the book of Acts. But anyway, now we move on to the next section, which is quite a few books, and it's called the epistles. That's just a fancy word to say letter. That's all. I happen to think that a lot of people make up big, important sounding words to make themselves sound smarter. That's my theory. Because most words have a pretty simple meaning, and we would use the word letter. So he wrote, these other books are like letters that were sent from the apostles, and out to the churches that were being built. And some of them, most of them were written by a guy named Paul, the Apostle Paul. But Peter wrote a couple of them. John wrote 3 of them. Jesus' half-brother James and Jesus' half-brother Jude wrote some. So, I mean, quite a few different authors wrote in these epistles that we have, or letters, okay? So we got that section of letters. Today we send emails. So, maybe you can say, well, Paul was sending an email to the church at Corinth. It took a while to get there, though, because they had to hand-deliver that email. But he even tells them in those letters, read it to the other churches around you. So, and they collected those things, and that's where we get all these letters that make up the majority of the New Testament. And then the last book is the book of Revelation. John got arrested for being a Christian because it was illegal by the time John was old to be a Christian. And the Roman Empire arrested him, and he got put on an island called Patmos, which we know where that's at. You can actually go do tours there. One of my daughters is in Europe and going to be in Asia and everything, and she's going to go through the Holy Lands. Don't know if she's going to make it to Patmos, but my niece did. I had a niece that went touring over there, and she got to this island called Patmos. And that's where John was held as a prisoner when Jesus came to him and said, I'm going to show you some things that are going to come to pass. And then he writes it down, and that's the book of Revelation. So that's what this book is made up of. So now we've got to recap real simple, we got a book of 66 other books, all put into one binder, okay? And in this binder, we have 2 sections, Old Testament, New Testament. Old Testament made up of 39 books, New Testament made up of 27 books. In that, written down by a little over 40 authors. Old Testament, I didn't bring this up, but it was written in Hebrew. New Testament was written in Greek, so 2 different languages. There's a few sporadic things in there, but that's what it's basically made up of. Old Testament in Hebrew, New Testament in Greek. It's written over a 1600 year period. It's written on 3 continents, Africa, the Middle East, what we would call the Middle East, Asia, and then Europe. And it's written over that time with all these different people, and yet it agrees 100% with itself on who God is, what his purpose for making humanity, and what to do with our lives, and even how it's going to, the entire system is going to be ended. It agrees with itself all the way through that, which is pretty miraculous because these are people that don't even know each other. And some of them hadn't read the others, and yet they came up with the same story. I can't even get people in my own household to want the same, to tell me what pizza's the best, okay? Much less who God is, something that important, what he wants from us, why we're here. These are questions that should be asked. These are things that people have asked throughout time. But these group of people came to the same conclusion. And that's some of the things we're going to talk about as we go forward in the podcast, Investigation Bible, as we look at this book through the eyes of a retired law enforcement officer. We will use systems of investigation, evidentiary laws and rules and everything else as we move forward. And then I want, once again, to have some guests in here to help us out too. So thank you for joining me for the first episode of what I hope to be quite a few in this new venture of podcasts that we are going to call Investigation Bible.